I want to tell parents everywhere something really interesting is I have never had a child in treatment who has welcomed a parent changing the rules, whether it's overcoming their anxiety, overcoming their very difficult behavior, attending school, getting homework done. I've never had a kid that came in agreeing that that was a good idea, but I can tell you universally what children tell me after they've changed their behavior and they're functioning better is they tell me, I like my family so much better. I love my parents. Dr. Cassiday, I'm so glad we came to see you.
Your mind can be your most valuable asset or your biggest liability, and you get to choose. This is the Building Psychological Strength podcast, where we explore ways to build resilience, build confidence, and make our minds work in our favor. We draw from the fields of psychology and life design to help us intentionally create a rock-solid mindset upon which a vibrant life experience can be built. My name is April Seifert. I'm a psychologist, a life design strategist, and co-founder of Peak Mind, the Center for Psychological Strength. Each week, I'll introduce you to an expert, a concept, a technique, or a hands-on practice that will help you build psychological strength in your own life. These are the tools to help you thrive. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Building Psychological Strength podcast. My name is April and I'm your host. You know, one of my biggest goals with this podcast is to bring you tools and techniques and resources and information from true experts in the fields of psychology and life design, because there's a lot of noise out there. And I want to bring you the real, credentialed, amazing experts who can bring you true information that can change your life in a way that is more accessible than having to go out and dig through research and other really boring, frankly, things like that. And today's episode is one where we are going to do just that. I am bringing to you an incredible expert in an area that impacts so many of us, and that is parenting. Now, this is something that is particularly impactful today because something happened recently that I think maybe a lot of you can relate to. So something that I've noticed is that I'm better able to relate to my kids, to be a better parent, to stay focused and stay focused on the long game, frankly, when times are difficult with my kids, when I've done a really good job of taking care of myself. So if I've done a good job of stepping away, of exercising, of sleeping, of doing all the things that help support us in being psychologically strong, all of those things help me keep my head on when my kids are, frankly, when they're losing it. Now, all of that is something that I try to do, but recently that didn't happen. Things got busy at work. I allowed myself to not do some of the self-care things that I try to do more regularly. And I noticed that my temper was more short with my kids. I was less able to maintain the presence and the, level-headedness that I try to maintain when I'm dealing with them when they're kind of freaking out and having a tantrum and having a difficult time with a rule or with a boundary that I've set. And I've noticed that taking care of myself, it's just another reminder that taking care of myself is something that is incredibly important in how I show up as a parent and in other important relationships. And we're going to dive into some of that today with this interview. Now, before I get into introducing this week's host, and before we get into the topic that we're going to be talking about with this week's episode, I want to give a quick listener shout out to someone who left an amazing comment on iTunes. This is somebody who goes by the name of CD_KC. So I don't know what your name is. I don't know how to shout you out properly, but thank you so much for this review. My first review of a podcast. Loved the episode with Dr. Livingston and the free resources. It's one of many podcasts from Building Psychological Strength that serves as a great reminder that we all have inner dialogue that is often on autopilot and goes unchallenged, unsilenced, and becomes part of who we are. As usual, the podcast includes both the why and the how to build our psychological strength and resilience. Thanks. I loved this review for so many reasons. Number one, it shouted out an incredible guest that we have had on the podcast. Glenn Livingston is a true expert in the field, and his episode number 137 is such an amazing one to catch if you haven't caught it. So I love that this listener shouted him out and the resources that he gave on that podcast. But also, he, I guess I'm making an assumption. I don't know. This person also did such a brilliant job of indicating the difference between that voice that we have internally who sends us thoughts and feelings that may or may not be true and may or may not serve us, the distinction between that thought process and who we truly are. And the fact that we get to decide whether we listen to those thoughts and those feelings, and we get to decide how far down the rabbit hole we want them to allow us to go. So I love this review for so many reasons because it's calling out some of the very fundamental processes that we talk about so often on this podcast. So thank you so much for that incredible review as a reminder of one of our amazing guests, Dr. Livingston, and also one of the powerful processes that we all deal with on a daily basis, and that is the constant stream of thoughts that happen from that inner voice. Okay, let's dive into this week's episode because it is a very powerful one where we are speaking to an incredible expert in the field. Let me tell you a little bit about her. This week, we're talking to Dr. Karen Cassiday, and she has her doctorate in clinical psychology. She's also nationally recognized as an expert in the diagnosis and treatment of anxiety disorders in children, teens, and adults. She's also done extensive research, her own research into anxiety, and she's extremely widely published. She's the past president of the prestigious Anxiety and Depression Association of America, and she's served on the board of Beyond OCD in Chicago. She has also been on the faculty of the International Obsessive Compulsive Foundation, Behavior Therapy Institute, so many other prestigious organizations. She's been featured on Animal Hoarders on TNT and NBC's Today Show. We have an incredible expert with us this week. I could keep going on because her accolades are seemingly unending, but what I want to say about Dr. Cassiday is that she's one of those experts that has an ability to not only bring to us the true evidence-based research and techniques that have been shown to actually work, and in this case, in the area of parenting, but she herself is a parent to 5 kids. So she knows what it's like. She can speak to us from that true human perspective of being the parent whose kid is losing it in Target and you are tired after a hard day and you're at your wit's end and you want what's best for that kid and you aren't sure what to do. She's been there. She knows it. And she's bringing to us this powerful information from her research and her broader field so that we can all become better parents, but do so in a way where we don't have to worry so much about so many of the things that don't actually make a difference in raising incredible kids. We talk about so many valuable topics, but what these topics and what our conversation, sort of the through line among all of the things we talk about is that parents are human beings. We all have a limited capability, and we're dealing with kids who are also separate human beings who have a separate set of capabilities given the age that they are. And we have to keep that in mind as we're moving through these, sometimes amazing, but sometimes very challenging experiences with them because, it can be easy for us to turn our sort of wagging finger and our perfectionistic thoughts on ourselves and think that we're doing the wrong thing all the time. It can lead us to go seek out information that might not be from the best sources. And it can lead us to just tie ourselves in knots because we want to do the right thing by our kids and we want to raise our kids to be amazing adults. And so many times we question whether that's, what we're actually doing. Are we actually doing a good job? So this episode was so powerful, for me as a parent, because I have those same questions. I have those same concerns and those same goals. I want to raise daughters who become amazing adults who are capable and effective living on their own. And Dr. Cassiday gives us so much information and so many tools to be able to do that. So I'm really thrilled to have her on the podcast. We are so lucky to have such an incredible expert on the podcast this week. And I am so excited to introduce you to Dr. Karen Cassiday. Karen, I'm so thrilled to have you on this episode today because the topics that we're going to talk about and the background that you have is so applicable to people and the way that they experience life, and just daily, it's very applicable to people. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, April. I am really excited to be here too.
Well, this is really exciting because we're going to get to talk about parenting today, which is a topic that affects obviously so many people. Many people become parents in their adult lives, but we're coming at it from the lens of psychological strength and how to raise effective kids and how to take care of ourselves while we do that, and everything that's wrapped up within this complex relationship of being a parent and wanting the best for our kids. So this is really exciting.
Yeah, and it's a big topic. And, one of the things that we see with parents today is they feel immense pressure to get it right. And in the general culture, people have the idea that if I do a good job of parenting, then somehow that will help my kid. Unfortunately, one of the things that seems to have happened with the advent of social media is it's become very, very difficult to try and wade through the clutter of opinions and information and science and to try and figure out which information is helpful, how do I apply it to myself and my family, and which stuff can I just ignore? And of course, there's a lot of loud opinions. And so one thing we see that the level of perfectionism in parents, and what I mean by perfectionism is the idea that there must be one correct way to do something, and then an overemphasis on, how bad it is if you make a mistake and deviate from that one correct thing has risen in our culture. And in general, it's made parents and their kids more anxious. So this is a hot topic, and I'm glad we're going over it.
Oh, gosh, me too. I mean, can I just be selfish for a second and say that as a parent of two young girls, I'm really excited to have you here. And I can think about the people who are listening to this and think, oh man, I bet they have, just from that intro, a lot of the same questions that I do. And I guarantee when you said perfectionism and making a mistake, every single one of us had a situation probably that happened recently that pops to mind like, oh, that's one of those. So I'm really excited that we're going to be talking about this. I want to start with that perfectionism piece because, social media has been around for quite a while, and I feel like there's an ebb and flow between, sometimes we're in a season where everybody is perfectly curated on social media, everything looks like this perfect highlight reel, and then we'll kind of get into these more realistic seasons where people are willing to show the background and sort of the hot mess that's going on behind the scenes. And I see that ebbing and flowing, but what's consistent is that there's a lot of blogs, a lot of information out there directed at people about what they should or shouldn't be doing. I mean, that piece just remains the same.
Yeah.
What does that mean for a person who is, again, as you said, trying to do the right thing, but having to wade through all of that information, some of which might not be very good?
Right. Well, one of the dilemmas is when we look at measures of self-doubt in women and self-confidence, we see an unfortunate thing that happens when they get pregnant. Their self-confidence goes down. They increase in self-doubt. And then the first 6 months that a baby is born, this is the first baby, then they get a slight increase. And then over the next 3 years, it just keeps going down. And this was done in a study with 85,000 women in Norway. And they stopped the study at 3 years. But based on my clinical experience, I bet it continues to go down. And And what we see is when you are not feeling confident, you do reassurance seeking. And that's where you try to find more and more information to try and see, does it stack up with your experience or what you think or someone else's? And then, of course, with the internet, you can find as many opinions as there are people. And people claim that there's research, and you have no way to know, is this something that a scientist would consider credible, or is it just someone knew someone that got a certain outcome? And, so we see the more information there is, the more difficult it is, and the more people get worried and anxious. That's one phenomena. And then the other one is that one of the unfortunate changes we see in our culture when we look at frequency of, we'll just say, strong negative opinions or critical opinions that are expressed, that has increased dramatically. And I don't remember the percentage off the top of my head right now, but when someone who's feeling self-doubt sees that, it makes everything seem more alarming. And then another thing that enters into that is we see that a general perception that parents now have is that life is very dangerous. And so if you were to poll people, almost 90% of parents would tell you there's more danger, more likelihood of interpersonal violence directed toward my children, kidnapping, sexual assault, bullying, you name it. And that's because of seeing media, which, focuses on the sensationalized negative story. And then the reality is when you look at the actual statistics, and this is where if you go to Lenore Skenazy's website, she has all this data from the best reports on crime statistics. We see actually crime rates are the lowest they've been in 40 years. And so it's safer for our children to go outside and play unwatched now and to go in the alley and to go into the large public restroom without us than it was when we were kids. But parents don't feel that way. And all of this puts pressure on parents because they feel like the stakes are really high. I've got to get it right. I'll get a lot of criticism if I make a mistake. And then, you add into that just parental love. I have 5 kids, 3 I acquired through marriage, and I love them dearly, and I would love to be able to make sure things go well for them, even though rationally I know I can provide a great environment, but I can't control the outcome.
That, I want to dig in right there. That was such a good opening, because something that comes up in my mind, and I've been very open on the podcast about how there have been a small handful of times in my life when I've gone to see a therapist to help me sort of sort out a lot of complicated feelings. The joke I make is that every once in a while, I feel like, the tornado has come through, all the stuff in my pantry has fallen off the shelves, and I'm like ready for somebody to KonMari my pantry. And that's when I go to therapy. So one of the times that I went, the discussion that we had was around what my role is as a mom and what my kid's role is as a child and what I'm responsible for. And so much of this is a nuanced topic, right? Because your self-confidence is wrapped up in that. The ability to feel like you're doing it right is wrapped up in your beliefs around that. Can you talk a little bit about you as a parent? What is your role? Because you touched on this around creating an environment. And then what's the role that our kids play, or maybe the responsibility of each of those people? Yeah.
This is a fabulous question, April. And it's one I am constantly talking about with my patients and when I go out and speak, because there's a lot of confusion about it. And I'll put it in a little context. 30 years ago, a mother's responsibility was considered to keep the house fairly tidy, to feed the kids, to make sure they had clean clothes, and to shoo them outside so that she could have coffee with her friends. And now when we poll parents, the list is unbelievably long and a lot of it includes, I have to have a child that makes good grades, that does extracurriculars, that accumulates a good resume, that gets into a good college, so they then make a good income. And so that's a lot of pressure. And so the thing that we see from research that really ought to be a parent's job is to direct yourself towards, I need to raise a kid who becomes a competent adult and can live without me, whether they're disabled or whether they're the most highest functioning human being you have. And I need to think about what makes someone effective. And that's different than one of the current trends, which is I need to be friends with my child and have a very close, attached relationship where we enjoy each other. Because if you think about the idea of discipline and creating deliberate boredom and deliberate difficult situations so your child develops self-worth and psychological strength, it means you're at odds with that kid. And it's very hard to stand back. Right now, I'm dealing with an 18-year-old who just bombed a bunch of courses in college and is, wondering about dropping out. And it is so hard to stand back and just validate his experience when, I'd like to step in there and do so many things that I think would be helpful. And so I get it. It's hard for parents to do that. So if you're thinking in terms of how do I make an effective human being, then that means you've got to think, well, what makes someone effective? And what we see is if someone's effective as an adult, it means they have an attitude that says, I'm on a journey in life as opposed to a destination, and it's going to involve constant striving, and it needs persistence. And there's going to be joy, which means I have meaningful pursuit and good, intimate relationships with people where I can readily manage conflict and still maintain a healthy relationship with them. It means I have to have a lot of practice handling difficult things. And then the other thing we see is, every parent that comes into me, they tell me, I want my kid to be happy. And I want them to have good self-esteem. And inside I cringe when I hear that. And the reason I cringe is because happy is not a good goal. And we see actually kids in their early 30s and younger, I shouldn't say kids, young adults down to children, now feel immense pressure to be happy and then mistakenly think something's wrong if I'm feeling distressed, when actually they're feeling normal if they're tired and studying for exams, if they're mad at you because you put them in timeout, if they don't like a teacher but they have to stay in that class for all of third grade. And then self-esteem is what we think of when it's sort of the sum of your accomplishments. And really what you want your kid to have is self-worth, which says, I know I'm a person of good character and I have integrity and I'm able to actually be the kind of person I admire even when it costs me. And when we see that as the goal, then we start to see kids who become amazing adults who can have moments of happiness and joy and purpose and good relationships, and they become the people we admire. So we want parents to reorient the task to and accept that there's going to be conflict, there's going to be pain, there's going to be struggle, and I am going to have to put a sock in my mouth and sit on my hands to stand back as my kid learns how to struggle.
That is so difficult, right? That's so difficult. And much of what you said, when you really think about what it looks like in practice, right? In actual practice, day to day with a kid, it goes so contrary to what we hear in, blogs and other things that you would encounter on social media, right? You use the words deliberate boredom. Like there should be this massive amount of white space in the day that the child, not you, the child has to navigate. And what's funny is those types of things, they sneak up on you because I'm thinking back. So I have an almost 4-year-old and I have a almost 17-month-old right now. So I'm not that far out of the very small baby stage. And thinking back to that stage, you really are very hands-on, right? They need you to eat. They need you to clean them. They need you to, basically do everything. The transition from that to the point where my 4-year-old is at, where she can do most things for herself, it's subtle. And we don't realize, and I've had to, on the boredom, side of things, I've had to legit think about, no, you are not cruise director for these kids. The 17-month-old is now able to open a drawer and get crayons out. She knows where all of these things are. Like, stop orchestrating every moment of their day. But gosh, that's hard. And that's just one example. We haven't even scratched the surface of discipline and setting up boundaries and repercussions for people's actions. It's so hard to do.
It is. And one thing I think that, is tough for parents is, for most of us, when we have that infant, that first year, it feels amazing to be the person who is able to make your child smile and giggle with delight. And it really is your job to take care of all their needs. But as soon as your child can point and grunt and start to indicate their needs, we should begin a process of gradual stepping back and encouraging this child to do things on their own. And so for many parents, it feels like a loss of closeness, when they're not helping so much, because it feels so powerful and so loving and giving to, make things be taken care of so easily. And then obviously, as kids get older, I've seen this happen in the grocery store and in my office so many times, where a kid is whining and complaining, and the parent finally goes, "I've had it. Okay, here's that candy bar," or "Here's the phone," and not thinking, "Oh wow, I just taught my child to be obnoxious in order to get what they want. Do I really want them to be that kind of grown up?" And it means, as a parent, you have to be willing to endure, and you have to be willing to be deliberate and intentional instead of just reactive and only thinking about, I want them to know for sure I'm loved. And I think another mistake that is, many parents in our culture believe that if my child felt thoroughly loved, then they would be mentally well. And that is so not true. I can think of plenty of people in federal prison who can tell you, "Grandma and my mom loved me dearly." It is not a guarantee for anything. Really, you need to think a parent's role is to do so much more than that. And it's to orchestrate an environment that funnels your child toward adulthood, where they get successive, graduated practice in doing harder and harder things that require independence.
I love that. I want to hit the discipline side of things on kind of two sides of the same coin. One, from the perspective of what the child is doing and what you're seeing, the sort of ripple effect on the child side, what's happening there. And then also mentally and mindset wise for the parent. I'm thinking back to my days in school where we would learn about behavior modification. And it's interesting because it's not something that a lot of people have learned about from sort of an academic standpoint. People learn, maybe they can think about the whole salivating dog thing, or, chaining certain behaviors together, or things like that. But on the discipline side with kids, one thing that I've noticed just with, interacting with other parents of kids similar to the ages of mine who maybe haven't had as big of a background in this, is something happens and you're not going to give the kid the thing that they want, right? And so they go from 0 to 60 and kick and scream and throw a fit, right?
Yeah.
Let's just say that goes from a 0 to a 7 on a scale of severity of, wow, they're really losing it right now.
Yeah.
What I don't think people get is that if you give in and give them that thing, or later on, if for some reason they don't get the outcome that they expected, so maybe they got it last time and now you're not giving them this time, that behavior can ramp up because what that kid is expecting is, oh, shoot, a 7 didn't get me there this time. Let's try a 9. And what I see people, and I'm curious to see if you've heard this or seen this in your work, where they look at that and say, see, I tried this thing, I'm not giving it to them, and it's not working because their behavior's getting worse. When in reality, all they're doing is they're trying to see, okay, well, this isn't where the boundary was. Is it here now? Like they're trying to figure out what the threshold is. I'm curious about your experience with that, with people you've worked with.
Yeah, actually, I'd say this is an extremely common problem. The name for this in science is called the Extinction Burst, and we try to teach parents about it. And the idea is that if you change the rules on your kid and you're saying, okay, when we're in the grocery store, you can't just grab stuff in the checkout aisle, or you're going to have to sit quietly here while we're in church and just deal with it. That when you change it and say, okay, now I'm really going to enforce this rule, any smart kid, whether they realize it or not, is going to ramp up what they're going to do to see, do you really mean it? And this is actually the sign of success. It's telling the parent, whoa, you're onto something. This kid has noticed that you've changed the rules. And the mistake that parents make is to confuse that with, oh, wow, now I made things really bad, as opposed to realizing, hey, my kid just noticed I changed the rules. And then the other thing we see is that if you can stick with it after that, the kid goes up and escalates their behavior, then usually it's going to sharply drop if you just hang in there. And pretty quickly after that, the behavior will start decreasing overall. But it means you've got to be ready and willing to endure that burst of increased bad behavior and realize animals do this. Toddlers do this, teenagers do this, grown-ups do this. It's just our instinctive, natural response when the rules change. Think about it this way. You press the button for the elevator and it isn't there, and then you press. That is the same kind of behavior, even though you already told it, the elevator, to the car to come to your floor. And, and that's a tough thing. And then I think the other thing that parents have to be ready to remember is kids are not grown-ups. And so with a grown-up, you might be able to tell someone, hey, I'd really like you to, talk to me in a different way the next time this comes up. And they might, most of the time, be able to pull it off, although they're human too. But kids are not that way. And so you really have to remember reasoning with them doesn't have the same effect or impact. We really have to show them. And what I tell parents is we learn best by seeing and doing. And that's true for all of us, no matter what our age is. And so one mistake I see a lot of parents doing is when the kid starts really ratcheting up behavior, they try to have a discussion. And And what I tell them is, when you were misbehaving when you were a kid and your parents wanted to have a discussion, how much did you welcome that? Didn't it just make you more irritable? and because I hated it when my dad said, we're going to talk, the talk. And that you need to just let things happen and stick to your guns.
That makes so much sense. I want to go to the opposite side of that coin then, because, we've talked about what that extinction burst actually is, right? It's a good sign, even though it feels awful in the moment. I mean, so horrible in the moment, but it's a sign that you're on the right track. How do parents put themselves, because this is one of those times where I can feel it, right? People are like, that's so easy to say. Oh my God, you crazy person on this podcast. That's so easy to say. How do we do that? How do we get ourselves in the right mindset or put ourselves in a place where we can endure? You know what I'm saying? Where we're in a place where we're not getting, because humans, it's so easy for us to sort of feed off of the emotion of other people. And when you have even a small person there whose emotions are very large, it can be really easy for you to sort of absorb that emotion and kind of lose it a little bit yourself. How do we guard against that, stay in the right mindset, stay focused on what the longer term goal is here? Like, how do we help people be more successful?
Yeah. Well, the thing that I encourage parents to do is number one, claim your authority. And that means decide that actually what you want to have happen for your kid in terms of helping them grow up is supreme, and your way of doing it is supreme, and it doesn't matter whether other people disapprove in public or cluck or don't understand. You're there to safeguard your child's future. And so take authority in that, no matter where you are. So not just inside your home where no one notices, but outside the home. And then the second thing that I tell parents is to think in terms of remembering who your kid is. Your kid is a child. And of course, one thing that happens when we're younger is when we express emotions, we do it in a much more on, off, all or nothing kind of way. And so with younger kids, crying is the default response. And then physical acting out is the default response. And when they become preteens and teens, verbal acting out is the response. And so if we can think of how can I Teflon coat myself against that and just look at it as like, this is just blah, blah, blah. And all it means is my kid doesn't like the rule, or my kid doesn't like the fact that I want a certain thing from them. And to notch it down. So instead of thinking my child is feeling unloved, or this is terrible, or they're out of control, you have to normalize it and say, this is just a normal way that my kid shows displeasure. And of course, they're going to say things, anyone who's had a toddler knows that if looks could kill, none of us would have survived our children's first tantrum. And I remember, both of my kids that I gave birth to made sure I knew that I was a poo-poo head at some point when they discovered that was a bad thing.
Yep.
And so we have to remember it's just blah, 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 blah. And then another thing we have to tell ourselves is, why not take care of it now? If I delay it, then I'm only going to have a bigger problem. And one thing that's very obvious to me now is if parents can master tantrums when they're younger, it's so much easier when they are a preteen or a teenager or a young adult. And to think of it as it's like I'm investing in an account of good mental health for my kid. If I go ahead and take the plunge now and I endure the tantrum and I keep my lips quiet and I just enforce the rule, and do it with impunity. And so those are things that help parents. And then, some parents really get moved by their children's tears. And so oftentimes that's because they're getting anxiety and they're thinking their child doesn't feel cared for. And I want to tell parents everywhere something really interesting is I have never had a child in treatment who has welcomed a parent changing the rules. Whether it's overcoming their anxiety, overcoming their very difficult behavior, attending school, getting homework done. I've never had a kid that came in agreeing that that was a good idea. But I can tell you universally, what children tell me after they've changed their behavior and they're functioning better is they tell me, I like my family so much better. I love my parents. Dr. Cassiday, I'm so glad we came to see you. And they love being better human beings. And it's a gift that parents can give them. And I find that so interesting. And that means you have to also remember kids do not have foresight. They are not able to think ahead and say, this is a fabulous idea that you're going to try and teach me how to be psychologically strong and grow up to be a really great human being. They just know, I would like to keep playing, thank you. I don't like chores, thank you. I would rather not have to learn how to use the potty. I don't want to go to school. And we've got to remember, we're the wise ones that can see the future, and therefore we've got to hang in there for them.
I love that. It's that whole short game, long game thing, right? And something you said earlier about learning to manage the tantrums now, otherwise you'll have a bigger problem. Something that my husband and I say all the time when, he and I are very aligned on how we want to raise our kids, but obviously he'll have weak moments, I'll have weak moments, right?
Yeah,
Like we
yeah.
try to support each other. And the thing that we always say is, you're going to put the work in regardless. You're either going to put the work in now,
Yes.
upholding this rule, or you're going to put the work in every time you go to Target. Like, which
Yes.
one do you want? You're going to do the same amount of work. You just have to either decide, are we going to do it now, or are we going to continue to handle this situation in this same way that just, isn't working for us?
Right. And then another thing I tell parents that get embarrassed easily when they're in public is to say, I want you to think about the short-term embarrassment you get now when your kid loses it at the mall or in the restaurant versus the shame you'll feel if your kid isn't able to finish school or have good friendships or a healthy relationship with a life partner, which is going to feel worse to you. And to look at it as like, we have to cut our losses sometimes and just say that. I mean, I had a great illustration here of this when my youngest, who is my intense child and has always been louder than everyone else when he cries or yells, he was about 2. We were in a grocery store. And I had told him, when we're done shopping with everything, we can go and you can hold a box of Captain Crunch, because at that point, just holding it was like a big thrill, and then we'd put it back on the shelf. And he decided he wanted to do that first thing. And he started yelling. And at some point, he yelled really loudly, "You're not the boss of me." and it was the kind of thing where everybody was staring at us. And I just told him, "Little dude, you are so not the boss." And I turned my back on him and I just walked away and left him in the cart in the middle of the aisle where he couldn't reach anything. And he yelled and yelled and was yelling, "You can't go away. You can't go away. I hate you. I'm the boss. I'm the boss." And it went on for what felt like an eternity. And finally he shut up. And I let him sit there for a while. And then I walked back and just said, let's finish the shopping. No Captain Crunch holding for you today. And what was interesting is I was expecting a lot of devil stares from people because I was clearly interrupting their shopping experience. But I actually had several people give me a thumbs up. And one lady winked at me and someone came over and said, "God, I wish I could have done that with my kids when they were young." And it was interesting, because I was feeling embarrassed, like, oh my God, great. Annan just went off on me at the worst time. But I actually ended up getting support. And, and then more importantly, my child had a moment of learning how to be a better human being, even though I may have wrecked many people's shopping experience.
What I love about that example is, number one, everyone who's a parent has that example where, regardless, I mean, how does it that it always happens in Target or the grocery store or something?
Yeah.
But totally. Everybody has that example. So it's very relatable. But there are some things that you mentioned that I wish we could normalize. And I wish we could help people understand that not engaging with your child, not feeling like you have to reply to everything that they're saying, it isn't being rude. It's not, discounting their feelings. It's not any of those things. It's almost like a natural, that helping them learn that there will be natural social repercussions for certain types of behaviors. Like if they scream at their friends, as they get older, their friends aren't going to want to play with them.
Exactly.
There's going to be natural social repercussions that are so hard to keep in mind in that moment. You've worked with adults and you've worked with parents, and you have this amazing background in anxiety and broader treatment than, working with parents. I'm wondering if, as we're winding down, you can talk a little bit about some of the practices that parents can do to get themselves in a place where they're really psychologically strong. Because
Yes.
the better parents are in terms of just their own well-being, the more, everybody uses that example, right? Like if your cup is overflowing, but it's true. If you're in a place where you're really taken care of, where your well-being is in a good place, you are better able to handle the craziness that comes with kids. So I'm wondering if you can give us just some tactical things that we can do to set ourselves up to be successful and take care of ourselves so that we can be in that position and persist when we need to.
Yeah. So one of the first things that I would recommend, and this is based on research, is to develop a good sense of humor and good humor. And I mean something very specific by that. I mean a recognition that of the absurdity of the fact that you are a human being with limitations raising another human being with limitations and limited skills. And being able to laugh at that, knowing we're all in the same boat and it actually is funny. I do not mean sarcasm. And I see a lot of parents using sarcasm, and sarcasm is a bitter way of expressing anger. And it is not helpful. It is a correlate of poor mental health. Good humor, where you can genuinely see the funny, is immensely helpful. And we see in families that have good ratings of mental wellness that there is a lot of good humor and shared laughter. And when we look at people who've been married a very long time, sense of humor is rated as one of the top things that kept the couple together. And we see it's an amazing way to release stress. And here's one way it's amazing that everyone should know. If you do a fake laugh or a real laugh, you get a shot of dopamine that is equivalent to what you get with 20 minutes of compassion meditation, which is very powerful too. So without any skill, if you can get yourself to laugh, then you can do something that immediately tries to reset that. Another skill that I recommend that's considered a mother skill of mental wellness is gratitude. And that means each day, no matter how bad it is, to figure out what about my time with my kids, my family, my life, am I grateful for? Am I able to see that there's value in it and that I am the blessed recipient of that thing? And we see if you do it when the chips are down and things are tough, then it works even better. So for example, with that example, I knew while my son was having that horrible tantrum that if I could hang tough and completely ignore him, he would learn emotional self-control. He would learn to respond better to other people. And I was grateful for the opportunity, even though it was embarrassing. And so gratitude is something to learn how to find gratitude every day. And then another thing that I would recommend is that that parents figure out, okay, what are the skills I need to cultivate that I don't have, and to be willing to use resources instead of feeling like I've got to do it all myself or I've got to be the expert. Because what we see is that every parent has ages and stages of their child that they just do better at, or one of their kids that they just, relate to better just because of their personality. And what we see is if you're really going to be a great parent, your skills have to constantly change and adapt to the child. And that means being willing to learn. If something isn't working, then have the humility to go and get help and to realize there is no shame. None of us came with instructions when we were born, and our kids certainly didn't. And as a professional, the real secret to working with kids isn't that one strategy fits all. It's that I know how to adapt a toolkit of strategies to a family or a child that most parents don't have. And so that would be another thing that would really, I think, help improve parents' confidence if they realize there's no shame in needing help. And of course they're going to need help. And to be willing to do something until it works better for their kid and their family.
That's so helpful. Those are so actionable. It's funny because we talk about gratitude so much on this podcast, but the reason why it comes up is because it's so helpful and it's so useful. It's one of those small things that you do that people think this can't possibly be having as big of an impact as it is, but it really does.
It's enormous. And one of the things we see in families that are functioning well and in marriages that are functioning well is that there's a lot of appreciation expressed to each other and a lot of affirmation. And the only way you can do that is if you're experiencing gratitude and have taught yourself to view those people that way as opposed to competitors for resources.
One tip that I heard from a good friend of mine, she mentioned this as we were chatting one day about, something kind of unrelated, but it was really helpful in those difficult times that you mentioned, trying to figure out what you're grateful for, even when times are hard. Her point was, if you're having a tough time, think about if you woke up tomorrow and the only things that you had left in your life were the things that you were grateful for today. Like, what if it was all gone? Like everything that you're not grateful for right at this moment, my mind immediately goes to some very specific places. Like, oh my gosh, I can't imagine if I lost these particular things. And that has made it so much easier for me on days where I'm very stressed out, days where I'm completely distracted, days where, just mentally I'm having a hard time focusing, for me to think, okay, no, there is actually quite a bit, even though this is a very difficult day and seemingly nothing's going right. There's a lot that I am actually grateful for, and to actually feel the gratitude behind it, not just say those empty words.
Yes. And and you're reminding me of something which is really important, that we see that people who have great resilience and psychological strength are people that view adversity, whether it's all your kids clamoring for your attention at once, or the tantrum in public, or the kid who fails, their finals, they view it as an opportunity for growth and as a challenge to be overcome as opposed to an obstacle. And gratitude is something that can help you, fine tune that view of opportunity. So one thing that I love having families do that, when you have kids that can write, is to have a family gratitude journal. You keep it in the car or the bathroom, someplace where everyone has to be. And the goal is to have everybody write in it every day. And then the rule is it has to be something about that day. And then if it's a bad day, then you have to find something to write down about whatever was a bad thing. And I found it can be really moving and bring people closer because they start discovering the world through the eyes of their child and see what really matters to them, or through their parents. I've found a lot of times with preteens and teens, this can really help thaw out a, sort of family conflict situation. And then the other thing that I've done with my family is part of what we do at Family Grace at dinners is everyone has to say one thing they're grateful for about that day. And for years, I was wondering, is this having any, good impact on my kids? It's supposed to. And I had one of my kids in the hospital. He was extremely sick, and they couldn't get an IV in because he was so dehydrated, and he was 11 at the time. And it turned out everybody was poking him, and finally they brought in like the intensive care pediatric nurse or whatever, and she told him, well, we're either going to have to go into your neck or your foot. And he's like, if we can't get it one last time in this other place. And he goes, go for it. And I was expecting him to just use very colorful words, but they got it in. And as soon as the team left, I was expecting him to just let loose with anger toward me about this situation. Instead, he turned to me and goes, Mom, I am so glad they got it in my neck, because that would have been so hard to pee if I had an IV in my foot. And And I had been feeling tragic about it, like, oh my God, my poor kid, this is terrible. I was trying not to cry. And him saying that made me go like, you are so right. That is amazing. And then I was just so pleased at his strength that he exhibited in a really horrible time that made it better for both of us.
Right. I mean, you think about what that gratitude journal or a daily gratitude practice is doing. It's the thing I joke about on this podcast a lot is that our minds are really powerful, but they're not that sophisticated. They just kind of run on some habits a lot of the time. And you can trick them into doing the right thing by just introducing this new habit. At some point, your unsophisticated mind will say, okay, whatever, she's going to make me look for something that I'm grateful for today. I might as well start looking right now. And you've trained it to focus on something different, and your life looks different when your mind is focused on things it's grateful for or finding meaning in awful situations, even when the situation is terrible.
Right.
This has been so amazing. Before I let you go, and you gave such a great introduction to it. I'm struggling with whether I should even ask you this question, but I feel like I'm going to because we've had such a great discussion. I would love to hear the way that you think about psychological strength, whether it's from the perspective of a child, whether it's from the perspective of a parent. I don't care. Take some liberties, go whichever direction that you feel, compelled to go. But I would love to hear what psychological strength means to you in the context of the work that you do.
Yeah, I'll talk about kids because probably people hear this less than they do about adults. And so when I'm looking for psychological strength in a kid, what I want to see is this kid has a drive to try and become more independent. And they're willing to do difficult things and that are appropriate for their age. So if they're a toddler, they're willing to struggle to try and get their leggings on or their coat on instead of immediately stopping and just waiting for an adult to help them. If they're an older kid, they're willing to do things that are difficult or boring or tedious without having a meltdown. I want to see a kid who can laugh easily and laugh at himself or herself and find the funny in life, and where they aren't taking everything as, super serious. And I also want to see a kid who's comfortable making mistakes and failing. And they approach making mistakes and failing as, well, I have to just try again. So they have a view that says, I've got to practice a lot and I've got to learn, and that's just okay. I don't have to get lots of awards and prizes. And then another thing I want to see is a kid who starts to learn what gives me joy in life. And so as opposed to focusing on what makes me look impressive, what actually do I like and makes me feel joyful inside? And they are pursuing that. And that's why we have kids have hobbies and we try different extracurriculars, is we're really helping to learn what gives them joy. And another thing I want to see is I like to see kids have solitary pursuits, hobbies, but things besides just digital activities. And so that they, if there was a blackout and they didn't have electricity, they could still entertain themselves or have fun. And also I like to see kids who read, as that is a correlate of developing empathy, of intelligence, of taking perspective. So I want to see that happening. And then the other thing I want to see kids do is to learn how to care for their body. So they learn to eat well, to get sleep, to pursue exercise on their own as they grow up and to enjoy it, and to realize they live in a body that if they take care of it well, it really has a great impact on their psychological strength.
I love that so much. If people who are listening to this want to learn more, or they want to dive in about maybe particular struggles that they have, or really just connect with you on this topic that you're so knowledgeable about, both from an academic perspective and from living it with the 5 kids that you have, how can people find you and connect with you?
Well, my website that they can go to is momswithoutworry.com. Or on Facebook, I have a group you can join called Moms Without Worry Community, or you can check out my page. And then on Fridays, 5 p.m. Eastern, I have the Moms Without Worry radio show where I interview experts about issues that have to do with parenting and child rearing and developing mental wellness in children.
Those are all amazing resources. This has been so enlightening. If anything, it's funny. Every day I have this. It's called a journal, but it's really like part journal, part reflective, and part where I keep my schedule and my to-do list, right?
Yeah.
But what it does is it forces me at the end of the day to write down what went well and what was a win and what did I learn and that kind of thing. And almost, I bet more than 3 times a week, one of the things that I write down that I learned or that I need to keep in mind is you are a human being. You can do a human being's worth of stuff. And that does not mean everything. And that does not mean perfection. And what I loved about our conversation is there was so much around that topic, that you cannot be everything to those little people. Right. You're an important part, but you are not everything. And you don't have to be perfect. And you're a human with your own, needs and, desires and things like that. And you can keep those in mind as you're, raising these incredible kids to be great adults. So I've really enjoyed this. I learned a ton that I can apply with my kids, and I just appreciate you being here and sharing your expertise with us.
Oh, thank you, April. This was really fun, and this is such a great topic to talk about because, we all have been kids, and many of us will be parents, and we all want to do justice to our children. Thank you so much.
It's a simple fact that nearly everyone in the world could benefit from building psychological strength, but not everyone will put in the time and effort to do so. But today you did. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Building Psychological Strength. Now, if you're interested